As fans of the History Guy well know, all good stories involve pirates. And as far as pirates go, you can hardly find one better known than Blackbeard, the legendary pirate who a British contemporary writer said frightened America more than any comet that has appeared there in a long time. But as Smithsonian Magazine notes, the fearsome buccaneer never scared Hollywood producers. And yet the Blackbeard of the movies, and shoot, even of his own time, was more legend than known fact, and the truth behind the beard might surprise you. The real Blackbeard the pirate deserves to be remembered.
Pirates, former law professor Robert Lee wrote in his 1974 book Blackbeard the Pirate, a reappraisal of his life and times, rarely wrote about themselves and their families. Lee notes that such men hope to acquire a vast fortune and return to his home without having tarnished his family name. Thus, pirates quite often use fictitious surnames, and there is reason to suspect that Edward Teach, the name by which Blackbeard called himself, and that in the period was spelled several different ways, may not have been his name at all. We might, in fact, never know his birth name. The same can be said of his place of birth. While his presumed age at the time of his death suggests that he was born around 1680, exactly where that occurred is a point of dispute. It has long been presumed that he was born in Bristol, and that is the assumption made by Lee, but that assumption is based more on Bristol's importance as an international seaport than any clear record of his birth. Others have speculated that he was born in America, in North Carolina or Philadelphia, but a 2018 edition of Smithsonian Magazine notes the research of maritime historian Bayless Brooks, who identified records of Captain Edward Teach in Jamaica, presumed to have been Blackbeard's father. Following those records, Brooks concludes that Teach's oldest son, also named Edward, passed up the inheritance that he would have received upon his father's death as the eldest son to his stepmother and half-siblings, and instead joined the Royal Navy.
These newly rediscovered records might be the first documentation of the life of Blackbeard prior to becoming a pirate, but there's really no way to know if this Edward Teach of Jamaica and Blackbeard were the same man.
Brooks' account might explain a documented fact about Blackbeard, however. While often presented as a bloodthirsty scoundrel, Blackbeard was, Lee notes, an educated man, for there's no doubt that he could read and write. Furthermore, Lee writes, he seemed at ease not only in the company of villainous ruffians, but also with governors, as if he were accustomed to moving in high circles. Brooks' description of the son of a sea captain of high status might explain the education that seems at odds with his ferocious reputation. And service in the Royal Navy also explains his knowledge of seafaring and navigation, although that is by no means the only possible explanation for his skills.
And then, what next?
Again, the record is thin. For all the attention on Blackbeard, Lee notes that he appears in hundreds of history books. The entire record of Blackbeard the Pirate covers a period of less than 2 years, starting in 1716. Captain Charles Johnson, in his 1724 work, A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, wrote that Teach sailed sometime out of Jamaica in privateers in the late French War, where he often distinguished himself for his uncommon boldness and personal courage. However, Johnson makes no explanation for how he came to that conclusion. A letter written to the governor of New Jersey by a merchant named John Logan in 1717 says that the men captured by the pirates operating in Delaware Bay had a great deal of free discourse with the pirates during their captivity. The letter offers a brief insight into Blackbeard's past. Their commander is one Teach, who was here a mate from Jamaica about 2 years ago. This implies that Teach was an honest mariner from Jamaica, sailing from the port of Philadelphia as late as 1715.
That is, as with much of the rest of Blackbeard's life, we simply have no record. Ideas that he served time in the Royal Navy or as a privateer are simply unproven.
If, however, Johnson is correct, the late war he references was the 1702 to 1713 Queen Anne's War, the American theater of the War of Spanish Succession. During the more than decade-long conflict, hundreds of privateers from France, the British Isles, and New England operated from Canada to the Caribbean, capturing enemy ships in the war. Fighting as a privateer would have provided good experience for a potential pirate. A 1957 edition of American Heritage notes, in Queen Anne's War, which involved most of Europe, both English and colonial ships worked the Spanish Main. Their shipmasters became familiar with the hundreds of island hideouts, the inlets, the coves, and the rivers that gave shelter for escape and surprise attack. Privateering, in fact, is rather similar to piracy, as American Heritage continues. The privateer was entirely on his own. He was only authorized to capture enemy ships, but neutrals sometimes fell into his hands, and it was easy to explain that the neutral ships were carrying contraband of war. It would not have been a surprise if such men turned to piracy after the war. As American Heritage notes, the life was so good indeed that when the war was over, the men who had enjoyed it became restless. The point, in fact, is made in the title of the American Heritage article. War makes thieves. Peace hangs them. Lee notes that following the war, the former privateers formed the loose pirate confederacy called the Brotherhood of the Coast and took control of New Providence Island in the Bahamas, where historian Michael Cranton wrote in the 1986 History of the Bahamas, all semblance of organized government broke down, and the pirates were in undisputed control. They called their outpost the Republic of Pirates. Although there was no record, of course the pirates are obviously not very much for record keeping, Lee speculates that Teach would have located his base there, and that is where he would have met Benjamin Hornigold, leading to the first confirmed record of Blackbeard the pirate. Multiple reports in 1716 mention Hornigold operating from New Providence. A merchant by the name of Henry Timberlake reported that 2 pirate sloops attacked his vessel, and their captains' names were Benjamin Hornigold and Edward Teach. While it's not known if Edward was working under the command of Hornigold or if they were working independently and simply aiding one another, they were seen splitting the food they plundered between the 2 crews. It is rumored that he had worked under Hornigold for around 2 years before he was given his own crew to command. On July 5th, 1717, Captain Matthew Month, a pirate hunter sent to investigate New Providence by the Deputy Governor of South Carolina, sent a report that listed both Hornigold, with a sloop with 10 guns and about 80 men, and Teach, with a sloop of 6 guns and about 70 men.
But Teach and Hornigold parted ways shortly thereafter. Some argue because Hornigold refused to attack British ships. Hornigold gave up piracy and in 1718 accepted the king's pardon. But Teach set himself on that path that would, as Time magazine argued in 2018, make him arguably the best-known pirate from the golden age of piracy.
His acts of piracy are well documented. For example, a letter dated October 1717, written by Philadelphia merchant John Dickinson and held in a collection of merchants' correspondence in the Historical Society of Philadelphia, and quoted in a 2010 edition of the Pennsylvania Journal of History and Biography, writes, "Thou mentions the pirating trade with you from the beginning of this month and until within the week. One Captain Teach, alias Blackbeard, is in a sloop which they called the Revengers. Revenge, about 130 men, 12 or 14 guns, having lain off our capes and taken 6 or 7 vessels inward and outward bound." An article in the newspaper The Boston News Letter the same year records Teach and his sloop capturing the ship of a merchant named Cod. In a speech to the Provincial Council in 1718, William Keith, the governor of Pennsylvania, called Teach a noted pirate who has done the greatest mischief of any to this place.
And while there is a relatively robust record of Blackbeard the pirate after 1716, still much of what we think we know about Blackbeard is likely a myth. For example, Blackbeard's famous pirate flag.
Blackbeard's notorious flag was of a skeleton wearing a crown, symbolic of the king of the dead, also known as Satan. The skeleton was seen holding a goblet, toasting the devil himself, and stabbing a heart with an arrow. This was thought to represent how Blackbeard's true love was piracy. We can make assertions about Blackbeard's true love, but was that really his flag? The Ocracoke, North Carolina Observer reported in 2021, absolutely no record from Blackbeard's time described his flag as having a 2-horned skeleton holding an hourglass and a spear or dart pointed at a bleeding heart. Historian E.T. Fox argues in his book Jolly Rogers, The True History of Pirate Flags, that the image of this flag being tied to any pirate didn't appear until 1912, when it appeared in the journal Mariner's Mirror. According to the journal, a pirate named John Quelch flew the terrifying flag that was not claimed to belong to Blackbeard until the late 20th century. In fact, Teach was more likely to have flown a simple black flag with a white skull. Rather than representing Blackbeard's true love, it represented a signal that any captain of the era would recognize, that he was being attacked by a pirate. Another part of the Blackbeard legend was his womanizing. Captain Johnson's General History of Pirates asserts that in his 2 years of piracy, Blackbeard was married up to 14 times by his first mate aboard his ship. Another ongoing rumor is that each time he made port, he would find a new wife and then have her killed before he left again. Some say that this way he was not having premarital relations. Others say it was the pirate in him not wanting to share. This might represent simple cavorting with prostitutes rather than actual marriages, but as with much reported in Johnson's book, there are no records to support the claim. There is record, however, of one marriage. Following Blackbeard's 2 years of piracy, he purported to repent and to seek to lead a normal life. Secured a pardon from North Carolina Governor Charles Eden in June of 1718 under the stipulation that he not only renounce piracy, but also be married and settle down. Mary Ormond was the daughter of William Ormond, who owned a plantation in Bath, North Carolina, and the wedding was attended by the Royal Secretary for North Carolina. Despite the legends of 14 wives, she was the only woman with a record of having become the wife of the notorious pirate. But Blackbeard returned to piracy, and there's no documentation of what happened to Mary following their marriage. There is a legend that after returning to piracy, he gave Mary to his crew as a present. But again, there's no documented account of this happening.
Teach left Bath and never returned, and in fact was killed shortly thereafter. And what happened to Mary is a historical mystery.
Perhaps the most enduring part of the Blackbeard legend was his brutality, a cold-blooded killer. But again, is the reputation reality? There are contemporary newspaper accounts of his brutality. The Boston Newsletter wrote in November 1717 that Teach and his crew very barbarously used Mr. Richardson, merchant of the Sea Nymph. But Trent University professor Arne Bielszewski noted in April 2010 edition of the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography that reports of brutal treatment of prisoners are notably missing from first-hand accounts of Teach. Professor Bielszewski writes, "It is interesting to note that the brutal treatment of victims is only mentioned, in similar words, in the newspaper accounts of Blackbeard. In fact, the image of Blackbeard as a fearsome and ruthless villain was created by the news media of the day."
That his nature was perhaps less brutal than it has been described shows in perhaps his most famous pirate endeavor.
In May of 1718, he held the port of Charleston, then pronounced Charlestown, South Carolina, hostage. 4 ships, including the infamous Queen Anne's Revenge, holding a crew of around 400 men, were commanded by Blackbeard to blockade the port. Any ships trying to enter or leave were captured, and a ransom was demanded. But while the ships captured were certainly looted for their valuables, the ransom demanded was something less than barbaric. Blackbeard demanded medicine, apparently for crew members infected with syphilis. When a prominent citizen named Samuel Wigg was taken prisoner, the ransom in medicines was quickly paid by Royal Governor Robert Johnson, and the prisoners were all freed. In fact, there are no first-hand accounts of Blackbeard killing another person until the event that resulted in his death, and even there, legend might surpass reality. Owing to his notorious reputation, a British naval expedition, led by British Naval Lieutenant Robert Maynard, was funded by Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood to hunt down the fearsome pirate and put an end to his exploits. The Boston Newsletter published an account that included an exchange wherein Maynard answered that it was Blackbeard he wanted, and that he would have him dead or alive, else it would cost him his life, whereupon Teach called for a glass of wine and swore damnation to himself if he either took or gave quarter. After firing his cannon, Blackbeard and his crew boarded Maynard's sloop, the Jane, where they were defeated in hand-to-hand combat, and Blackbeard killed. As with much of the Blackbeard legend, the battle has been highly dramatized. The Newsletter wrote Maynard and Teach themselves to begun the fight with their swords. Maynard made a thrust, the point of his sword, against Teach's cartridge box and bended it to the hilt. Teach broke the guard of it and wounded Maynard's fingers, but did not disable him, whereupon he jumped back and threw away his sword and fired his pistol, which wounded Teach. DeMelt struck in between them with his sword and cut Teach's face pretty much. One of Maynard's men, being a Scottish Highlander, engaged Teach with his broadsword, which gave Teach a cut on the neck. Teach saying, "Well done, lad." The Highlander replied, "If it be not well done, I'll do it better." And with that he gave him a second stroke, which cut off his head, laying it flat on his shoulder. It is quite a dramatic telling, given that Maynard's own account, the only first-hand account of the battle known, says merely of Blackbeard's death. He fell with 5 shot in him, and 20 dismal cuts in several parts of his body. Rather than a dramatic beheading by a Scottish crewman, Maynard wrote, "I have cut Blackbeard's head off, which I have put on my bowsprit, in order to carry it to Virginia." Blackbeard's life of piracy was over, but his legend had just begun.
So why is it that the legend of Blackbeard is so much larger than the actual documentation? Well, there might be several reasons. Newspapers might have had reason to exaggerate the legend in order to sell more papers, or perhaps to try to convince the British government to become involved in fighting pirates. But there's even motive for Blackbeard himself, who went months at a time without bathing or combing his hair in order to appear more fearsome and repulsive, to embrace a legend that would have meant that his potential victims were more likely to surrender rather than face his legendary wrath. But a lot of it has to do with Captain Johnson.
A general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates has been so influential that British naval historian David Cordingley wrote in the preface to a 2010 publication of the then 286-year-old work, "It has been said, and there seems no reason to question this, that Captain Johnson created the modern conception of pirates." And the British Royal Armouries notes that most of what we know about Blackbeard and his fellow pirates comes from this one source. But while it is largely agreed that the modern conception of pirates came from Captain Johnson, the accuracy of that conception is demonstrated by the fact that there is no record of any actual Captain Johnson, which is almost certainly a pseudonym. Professor Bielczewski puts it simply: this book is not a reliable source. The chapter on Blackbeard is particularly riddled with exaggerations, misunderstandings, and factual errors.
And so, aside from a few sparse newspaper accounts about him taking ships off the American coast, the record of his wedding, and Maynard's description of his death, almost everything we know about Blackbeard the pirate comes from a disreputable source that was subject to exaggeration. And maybe that's really the secret. Maybe all good stories involve pirates because they really are just stories. And as maritime historian Donald Shamet told National Public Radio in 2018, the outlaw, the bad guy, is almost always the most interesting character in the story. Mark Twain, perhaps, summed up our fascination with pirates best in his 1883 work, Life on the Mississippi. Every now and again we had a hope that if we lived and were good, God would permit us to be pirates. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.